Good morning, community leaders, clergy, and most especially volunteers of the Chevra Kadisha. I actually stand here and am addressing you somewhat unexpectedly. About a month to 6 weeks ago, Harold Lipton sent me an email asking if I would be willing to share a Dvar Torah at the volunteer luncheon. And I happily agreed. Teaching Torah is what I do. But as perhaps some of you have experienced yourself, you get so caught up in the whirlwind of life and your to-do list that you don't read the rest of the email. I thought I was going to be sharing just a short 3-minute Dvar Torah. And about a week or two later, when I return to the email, when I finally have some time to actually read the things that people write to me, I encounter a much larger, much longer, detailed description of what I would be doing. Quasi-keynote speaker type address. And my heart dropped, because as much as I love teaching Torah, I also would prefer to give a 3-minute talk instead of speaking for a considerably longer period of time. My wife assured me, though, that if I do speak for only 3 minutes, nobody would complain. I did think I did give this a good and long think. And as I prepared, I realized that my own distraction, my preoccupation, worry about things like credit, to-do lists, and tasks that have to be performed is the perfect foil for the work that the Chevra Kadisha does. When we think of the Chevra Kadisha, we define its work as the personification of chesed. Chesed is a very difficult word to translate because it has a multiplicity of meanings. It can mean kindness, it can mean benevolence, grace, acts of loving kindness, so on and so forth. But tradition asks the question, when we talk about acts of kindness, when we talk about chesed, how do we measure one kind of chesed over another? There are many forms of benevolence. Are all acts of chesed created equally? Our sages, Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrashim, they do provide some answer for this. To quote from Maseches Sukkah, from a tractate from the Talmud Bavli, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, B'shlosha devarim gedola gemilos chasodim yoser min hatzedakah. In 3 ways, we find that acts of chesed are premier. They're the pinnacle. They far surpass acts of tzedakah. And it goes on to enumerate. Tzedakah b'mamono. When it comes to giving charity, charity can only be performed with one's money. Gemilos chasadim begufo. When it comes to acts of chesed, benevolence, this exceeds charity because even a poor person who doesn't have the means to give charity is capable of giving and of doing. Chesed can be done by anyone. Tzedakah la'aniyin. When it comes to giving charity, tzedakah can only be given to the poor. Giving money to the wealthy is no meritorious deed. However, when it comes to doing chesed, chesed can be performed for anyone. So we already see that chesed is greater than charity because it can be done by anyone, for anyone. But Chazal add an additional component to chesed. The Gemara says, tzedakah l'chaim. Charity can only be given to the living. A poor person who passes away, there's no more tzedakah that could be performed. Gemilos chasadim, acts of chesed, can be done bein l'chaim, bein l'mesim. It can be done for both the living and the dead. Why is it then that we say that the acts of chesed, which are highlighted as the premier form of benevolence, and we elevate the benevolence, the acts of chesed that we do for those who have passed away, where the Gemara sort of makes a point that this is the most significant way in which we see that chesed is premier, it's important. So obviously, the chesed that's done for the deceased is considered to be of the most premier importance. Well, it's because the chesed that's performed for those who have passed away is an act that will never be appreciated. The benefactor will never receive anything in return. They will never get acknowledgement from the person on the receiving end. The favor will never be returned. They will never get their recompense. Nothing is coming back from the person receiving the act of chesed. And this elevates it to a sublime act. And we know this from a pasuk, a verse that was cited earlier. When Yaakov was on his deathbed, we read in Sefer Bereshis, Vayikruvu Yemei Yisrael Lamus, Vayikru Livno LiYosef. When Yaakov was on his deathbed, when his end was drawing near, he called out to his son Yosef. Vayomer lo, and he said to him, Imna matzasi chen be'einecha, if I found grace in your eyes, Simna yodecha tachas yurechi, place your hand under my thigh, make an oath, ve'asiso imodi chesed ve'emes. Do an act of truth and kindness. The Midrash Rabbah asks the question, is there such a thing as a chesed that's not truthful? Is there a false chesed that could be performed? And the Midrash answers, kindness performed for the dead is a chesed shel emes, for the giver does not look towards any kind of recompense. So we know that chesed is greater than charity. It's greater than tzedakah. And we know that the greatest form of chesed is the chesed that's performed for the deceased. The truth is, the commentators point out, that any act of chesed must be done l'shem shamayim. It should be done without any expectation of recompense. This is the ideal. However, we know firsthand that this is exceptionally difficult. When somebody performs a chesed for an individual who is living, there's a still tiny part of the human brain that craves acknowledgement. We all want that thank you. We all want that appreciation. And according to the mystics, there's no such thing as an act of chesed that is completely stripped of the human ego. We know this from Jewish institutional life. When was it the last time that you saw a synagogue building that had been built that did not have somebody's name on the side? You walk into a congregation, there are plaques everywhere for a mezuzah that's donated. This is in memory of so-and-so by this individual. The doorway has been graciously supported and designated in honor of a gracious donation by so-and-so. The window is the Yaakov Shlomo's memorial window. There's not a single item or act of charity where a person is able to strip out the need, desire, and want for acknowledgement. However, that is the ideal. That is what we're meant to achieve. That is what we strive for. This human frailty helps explain a cryptic nuance to be found in Masechah Sota, another tractate, another statement from Chazal. Omer Rabbi Chama ben Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chama ben Rabbi Chanina says, "Mai dichsiv achrei Hashem Elokeichem telechu." You shall walk after Hashem, your God. How do you walk after God? God doesn't have a body. He makes no steps. How do you walk on a path that follows Hashem if Hashem never walks along that trail? So the answer is that this is a metaphor. To quote, L'halech achar midosav. We should walk, we should follow God's ways. Follow in his footsteps metaphorically. Mahu malbish arumim, just as God himself dresses the naked, af ato hilbish arumim, so too you should clothe the naked. Hu biker cholim, God visited the sick. We know this from Avraham, that God visited him after his circumcision. Af ata baker cholim. So too you should visit the sick. Hu kovar mesim. Hashem buried the dead. We see this with regards to Moshe. Af ata kavor mesim. So too you should bury the dead. The commentator, the Ksav Sofer, Rabbi Shmuel Binyamin Sofer of 19th century Pressburg, he focuses on the linguistic shift in the text. If you follow in the Hebrew, when it comes to clothing the naked, what do we say? Just as God, so too you. However, when we deal with the deceased, there's no stress on being like God. All we're told is that God did this, so too you. But the text does not highlight that you must take extra focus and concentrate on being godly. And he explains that when we deal with the living, it's very hard to act like God. We have to consciously strip away our ego and our desire for thanks in order to ensure that the act is pure. However, with the Chevra Kadisha, those who engage in kavod hames, ensuring the dignity of the departed, there is no need for that reminder. This is because the recipient will never say thank you. The action is automatically godly. We are in the act that we all perform on behalf of those who have passed away, not just imitating the divine. In that room, we are the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Chevra Kadisha personifies godliness in the world of ego. Historically, the Chevra Kadisha has always been the bulwark, the silent guardians who preserve the dignity of the Jewish soul, even when everything is under threat. According to Jewish law, it's prohibited to delay the burial of the dead. And we try to bury the deceased as soon as possible. And in fact, we generally say that one has violated a Torah prohibition if we allow a body to remain unburied overnight. However, there are various times when this is permitted, because the core issue is respect for the deceased. If by delaying burial we're able to preserve the dignity of the deceased, then it is acceptable to delay burial. For example, if we don't have a casket, if we don't have tachrichin, or if family members are traveling from afar, delaying the burial is itself an act of kavod hames, a way of ensuring the dignity of those who have passed away. Only under those circumstances is delay acceptable. Historically in Europe, cemeteries were located right next to towns. It's not like today where somebody might pass away as a sunbird in the southern United States and have to be shipped back to Calgary in order for them to be buried. Because cemeteries were right outside of the places where people lived, somebody who passed away would be buried that very same day. Even on a Yom Tov, we would hire non-Jews to bury the deceased. We don't do this any longer. We don't bury the deceased on Yom Tov any longer because we no longer live adjacent to cemeteries and we don't drive on Yom Tov. However, the traditional practice does still remain that we encourage and we insist on burial as soon as possible. This came under challenge in the 18th century. During Moses Mendelssohn's time, Jewish burial practices came under attack by those who questioned whether the deceased were truly dead. There were various stories circulating about people being buried alive, with tales of individuals screaming from inside graves. Some went so far as to place bells inside caskets so that if somebody woke up, they would be able to ring for help. In 1772, the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin issued an order requiring Jews to wait 3 days before burying the dead to ensure that the person was truly deceased. In addition to medical concerns, the Duke had been influenced by a Jewish apostate who had convinced him that the only reason that Jews buried their dead so quickly was due to Kabbalistic reasons, and dismissed it as a phony superstition. So the Jewish community, with their burial practices, specifically was the Chevra Kadisha that acted, turned to two great Jewish leaders of the day in the hope that they would write letters, issue rulings indicating that this was not superstition and it was based on Jewish ritual, Jewish practice, halacha, and Torah law. And so they asked two individuals. Mendelssohn was one. He was a massive figure of the Enlightenment, often referred to as the Jewish Plato. He had significant access to German nobility. Their hope was that he would write a letter advocating for traditional Jewish practice. The second individual they asked for a ruling was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Now, for the uninitiated, that name is not particularly significant. But within the rabbinic milieu, he is an exceptionally important figure. Rabbi Yaakov Emden was of premier rabbinic importance. Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote his letter first. He replied that it was absolutely forbidden to change the traditional practice of immediate burial based on far-fetched concerns of burying someone alive. This historical debate touches on how death was traditionally determined. In 18th century Prague, paintings from the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, showed doctors holding a feather up to a person's face. If there was no movement on the feather, no breathing at all, the person was declared dead. And this traditional metric still remains as the halachic parameter. In order for someone to be considered halachically deceased, a feather test is the determinant factor. In the absence of a doctor's declaration, a feather is what we use. And this actually has ramifications for how if we determine brainstem death is actually death. According to Moshe Feinstein, if the person is still breathing, the feather is still moving, the person is still alive. Moses Mendelssohn was a pivotal leader of his time. He found himself in a complicated position regarding the Duke's decree, and he authored two distinct letters. On the first letter, he wrote in German. He aligned himself with the traditional view espoused by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He argued that delaying burial was in direct opposition to Jewish law. However, it's widely understood that this letter was sent primarily for the sake of Jewish solidarity. It would have been damaging for two major Jewish leaders to present conflicting views before the secular government. In contrast, Mendelssohn wrote a second letter, a Hebrew letter that was sent to the Chevra Kadisha. They were perplexed by this, and they forwarded the letter to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And this precipitated a flurry of letters being written by these two notable characters, individuals, and we have those letters that they wrote back and forth. In Mendelssohn's letter, he argued that the Duke's order to wait a few days did not actually contravene Jewish law. He pointed out that the rabbis were already allowed for the postponement of burial in specific instances, such as we mentioned before, waiting for family members to arrive. Mendelssohn reasoned that if burial could be delayed for the sake of the living, it most certainly can be delayed if there remains even the slightest scientific doubt that the person is truly dead. Mendelssohn's position is often labeled as one of the first examples of someone enacting a reform in Jewish ritual life. But he viewed it differently. He argued that he wasn't innovating. He was returning to an authentic practice that goes back to the early days of the Jewish people. He cited ancient practices where bodies were placed in caves or catacombs and watched for 3 days to check for signs of life, which was exactly what the Duke was now requesting. To support this, he referred to one of the Masechtos Katanos, one of the minor tractates, collections of Braisios, oral teachings that date from the Gaonic period. In Maseches Semachos, or Evel Rabasi as it's sometimes called, in chapter 8, it describes how people would visit the cemetery for 3 days to check on the deceased. It even records cases where people were thought to be dead, were in fact alive, who went on to father or mother many children. Mendelssohn argued that if the ancients who lived closer to the sources of tradition were concerned about premature burial, then contemporary Jews should be even more cautious. However, Rabbi Yaakov Emden completely rejected Mendelssohn's reasoning. He argued that the halachic requirement for immediate burial was universal, practiced by both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, from Far East until the western extremes of Europe. He maintained that it was unthinkable to suggest that all Jewish communities for generations had been practicing burial incorrectly. Rabbi Yaakov Emden also addressed the archaeological evidence of caves and catacombs by noting a geographic reality. In the land of Israel, they had easy access to caves where the body could be placed and be considered underground, buried. The body could be checked and monitored for life while still being under the ground. The person was buried immediately. In Europe, where such facilities did not exist at all, leaving the body exposed to the elements or just being out of the ground, above the ground, was a profound sign of disrespect. Therefore, he argued, the universal custom is the correct custom, that of immediate burial in the ground. The debate ultimately centered on the legal definition of risk. Rabbi Yaakov Emden argued that Jewish law does not take into account remote possibilities or far-fetched cases that might happen every 100 years. He compared it to how we function in a modern society. Think of our own lives. We all get into cars. We all ride on airplanes. We don't lower the speed limit to 10 kilometers an hour to bring the number of road deaths down to zero. The law operates on what is normal and what is probable. And if we were to take every far-fetched, unusual, unlikely outcome into consideration, we would not be able to live full, healthy, and normal lives. The debate between Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Moses Mendelssohn also touched on the authority of medical science within religious law. Rabbi Yaakov Emden argued that while we listen to doctors in specific halachic contexts, such as asking a doctor whether or not it's acceptable to eat on Yom Kippur if we have a health concern, we do not allow medical opinion to overturn a universal Jewish practice like immediate burial. To Rabbi Yaakov Emden, once a tradition is established, the shifting opinion of secular science does not have the power to dismantle it. He viewed doctors' claims about premature burial as an external pressure that shouldn't interfere with established religious norms. In the late 18th century, the formal reform movement did not yet exist. Rather, Yaakov Emden was contending with Haskalah. Haskalah was gaining momentum. This was the movement of Jewish enlightenment. This movement attracted intellectuals who sought to merge into the modern world, even dropping Jewish tradition and identity in the name of integration, essentially assimilation. The vanguard against the assimilation inherent in delayed interment was the Chevra Kadisha that valiantly sought to ensure that halacha and Jewish identity be preserved. The Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, of 18th century Pressburg, He asks the question, why is the Chevra Kadisha called the Chevra Kadisha? In the world of halacha, there is no greater source of ritual impurity or tuma than a corpse. If the volunteers are constantly in contact with the deceased, the highest level of impurity, why are they then referred to as holy? The Chevra Kadisha, the holy society. And he answers, while there may be ritual impurity on the surface, the internal reality is one of absolute sanctification. The volunteers of Chevra Kadisha purify themselves through their selflessness. You are the ones who look into the face of mortality and respond with the most selfless and most truthful kindness that a human being can offer. You emulate godliness in the physical world. So what then provides the strength of character, the fortitude that enables the Chevra Kadisha to be that defense against the vapid, false, and decidedly un-Jewish system of values that barrage us consistently? The Midrash in the Yalkut Shimoni provides an answer. It quotes in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Abba, Shtei midos shel gomlei chasadim. There are two premier acts of chesed that a person can perform. Ligmol chesed im hakala v'im hames. One can accompany a bride to her marriage canopy, or one can accompany a person on their way to their ultimate destiny. If you find yourself, Rabbi Shimon continues, confronted by the possibility of performing only one of these two acts, an opportunity to perform one or the other presents itself, which should you take advantage of? And he quotes a pasuk from Koheles, from the book of Ecclesiastes. Bo Shlomo HaMelech came and he told us, Loleches el beis ha'ovel, follow after the interment. The reason, the commentators explain, is that the encounter with the deceased changes you. The meeting with the finality of death provides a reorientation of values. It's impossible to walk out of the Tahara room and not understand what real priorities are. It's difficult to give importance to the silly, the transient, the tertiary, when the finality of all things routinely is placed before you. The fortitude to combat the prevailing culture that surrounds us come from those reoriented values that we acquire through the tasks, the job, the obligations of the Chevra Kadisha. You are the guardians of our history and the personification of God's mercy. Thank you for the work you do when no one is watching, and for the truthful kindness that keeps our community and our values whole. Yasher Koach to all of you. And thank you very much.